Welcome to this edition of Theological Journals, 1:26 p.m., July 7, 2022. Apologies are cheap unless accompanied by action. Sean Franklin, staff writer. When Geronimo Henry stood up to speak at a May 3rd meeting between the indigenous community meetings and the residential school survivors and Archbishop Justin Welby in Toronto, he told the story of his 11 years in the Mohawk Institute Residential School near Brantford, Ontario. He told those gathered how he and other children had been locked in an empty playroom for hours at a time, gazing out the single window and wishing to see his mother drive up the lane to bring him home. He told them about when the city of Brantford built a dump out behind the school, and he and other boys would sneak out to rifle through it for food to supplement the school's paltry fare. And he told them that when Stephen Harper's government issued its official apology for the residential school system in 2008, he used to take a printed copy with him to speaking engagements at universities, so that when someone asked what he thought of the apology, he could take it out and rip it up. Why did it take the churches and government so long to bring out this apology? Don't they know the schools closed in 1970, asked Henry. That's when they should have come and gathered us all up and said they were sorry. But they never. Canada's Indian residential schools began to close in earnest after 1969, when the partnership between the federal government and churches that had run them dissolved. The Mohawk Institute closed in 1970. When Welby spoke, he replied, the Church of England and the Anglican Church of Canada, year after year after year, had the choice of saying this is not what should happen. I don't understand why they didn't. The church deliberately colluded, went along with, and invoked the name of God to support the most terrible evil. We turn to church, page 8, to finish the article. Welby pledges release from school records. Sorry for the interruption. Welby stressed that there was nothing that would make up for the harm, but repeated a promise he'd made at several other stops. On his April 28 to May 3rd visit to Canada, while his power over the international communion was limited, he said he would do everything in his power to lead the church to advance in the cause of reconciliation. That would begin, he said, with carrying what he had heard in hours of testimony from dozens of survivors in Toronto, in James Smith Cree Nation, and Prince Albert in Saskatchewan, back to his summer Lambeth Conference in England, where the rights of the indigenous peoples are central theme on the agenda. Apologies are cheap, if not accompanied by action, said Welby in a similar speech in Prince Albert. I will commit them that as much as I am able, I will do that in partnership with survivors, not as some distant smart aleck who decides what you need and then does it to you. Put that up in our next edition as we turn to Trinity Journal. Philip Derstine on the ancient Israelite calendar. Some wonkiness. This view is at odds with Stern, who argues that the intercalation of the 13th month in the ancient Jewish lunar calendar was not regulated by the solar year, but instead by seasonal agricultural criteria such as Aviv, and thus was only directly related to the solar year. and surmises that many ancient sources consider the Jewish calendar to be based on the moon and hence lunar. Hence, he considers the term solar a misnomer. However, if the state of barley, aviv, was the Mosaic criterion for setting the first month, then why is aviv missing in Exodus 12:2? The term is used 4 times of the month when Yahweh delivered Israel from Egypt. It is absent from Exodus 12:2, 23:16, and 34:22, and other passages that stipulate when the feasts are observed. Since climate conditions in Canaan yield maturity dates that differ from as much as 6 weeks, Siegel rejected the barley status as a guide of intercalation. Contra Stern, the equinoctial and solstitial criterion for governing the head of the year is inferred by the sun's role in determining festivals found in Genesis 1:14. Genesis 1:16 adds, God made 2 great lights, great luminary to govern the day, author's translation, the others for the sun to rule by the year and govern the time of festivals in the light-based calendation system of Genesis 1:14 to 16. If the start of the solar year is pegged to an equinox or a solstice, the temporal context of Exodus 12:2 and the original Passover reduces options to the spring equinox. Thus, it is safe to assume the earliest calendar of Israel was indeed luna-solar. And we will pick that wonky piece up again as we turn to Anglican and Episcopal History on Historiographies of the Lambeth Conferences. In his final chapter, he quoted George Luxton, Bishop of Huron, who as late as 1968 had desired to see the Lambeth Conference become an international Anglican synod. Luxton believed that the expense of the Lambeth Conference every 5 years would be among the best spent money in our church life, not at least because it recovers for us a vision of world servanthood. Consequently, Luxton feared that the ACC, if it failed to maintain a vision of international Anglican unity, would undermine the Anglican communion as a whole. Stevenson quoted Archbishop Michael Ramsey to the same effect, noting his view that the ACC could not function as a substitute for the Lambeth Conference. The appeal to moral authority made by Ramsey and Stevenson in 1967 began to look very different following the creation of the ACC. Anglicanism and the Lambeth Conferences is an early witness to the as yet unresolved intertwined issues of ecclesiology and international Anglican administration. Against this background of the newly emergent dispute, Stevenson ably portrayed the Lambeth Conference as an institution that fostered Anglican self-awareness. As he continued his introduction to Anglicanism and Lambeth Conferences, Stephen noted the various travel itineraries that often accompanied the Lambeth Conference. There are distinctions here likely lost on those without a background in English history, but in fact several of Stevenson's examples predate 1066, the year of the Norman conquest, which saw the final transition from Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into what is now England. For example, Stevenson noticed that the Fourth Lambeth Conference met not in 1898, but 1 year earlier, At that conference, to celebrate the arrival of St. Augustine, the bishops made a visit to Ebbsfleet. Stevenson further detailed how travel to places such as York and Durham had brought the Anglican bishops face to face with saints such as Paulinus, 644, York, Cuthbert, 687, Durham. Of course, Lambeth Conferences also put bishops in touch with the post-1066 English histories such as that of Anselm, Lanfranc, and Becket, as well as later figures such as John Cosin and Joseph Butler. It's exactly the sort of historical ecclesiological interest that modern high churchmen would value, and grouping all this under the monolithic label of Englishness ignores significant fault lines within English history. For Stevenson, the Lambeth Conference was inseparable from its repeatedly demonstrated ability to put bishops, and by extension their dioceses, in immediate material proximity to a far deeper Christian period. And now for the second article on Michael Ramsey and the planning of the 1968 conference. An event such as the Lambeth Conference, unfolding over a full month, is the work of many hands. To determine just how much of the conference shape was due to Ramsey and how much to the steering committee and to Dean is beyond my scope. Ramsey certainly acted to alter things with which he was not content, but there were innovations which so closely accord with Ramsey's own priorities that even if not promoted by him, then would surely have been heartily approved. Lambeth 1968 was at some distance the largest conference up to that point, due to the decision to invite not only diocesans, but all bishops in active service. This added some 48 suffragans to the total from England alone. The greater availability of air travel was certainly a necessary condition, but there were more positive reasons for the growth in numbers. The change in policy reflected a subtle distinction more characteristic of the Catholic Ramsey than of Fisher between the administrative and juridical function of the bishop, exercised only by the diocesan and metropolitan, and the sacramental and teaching function that all bishops in active service shared. We feel the important thing is to be the bishop in the Church of God working, Ramsey told reporters, and the distinction of bishops and suffragans and assistants isn't a distinction to be recognized. And to invite suffragans and assistants, Ramsey argued, was to enable a greater representation of the African provinces. Of the 19 bishops from the province of West Africa, 8 were assistant bishops. This was more than merely fairness. It was an acceptance, indeed anticipation, of what the African and Asian churches had to offer. We shall find culture challenged by culture, as well as doctrinal emphasis challenged by doctrinal emphasis. Ramsey told the convocation in May, we may all learn rather painfully that the cultural clothing of our Christianity may not be of the esse of the church at all, and may in some way be a hindrance to it. One Australian bishop, veteran of more than one Lambeth conference, felt that there had been a new and distinctive freedom in fellowship in 1968. The power of the English bishops to create awe in the spirits of their overseas brethren was gone. Now for Anglicanism, Lambeth Conferences, and international relations like the Hague Convention, League of Nations. The momentous step which the 1920 Lambeth Conference took, and its vigorous adoption of the still emerging League of Nations. In the League of Nations, we have an instrument and the application of great principles which all Christians should welcome with both hands. It was no fruit of a sudden impulse, but was strictly in the line of historical development from the writings of Grotius to the decision of the Hague Conferences. It was obvious that the clauses of the Covenant of the League enunciated Christian principles. The report did not rest content with generalities. It was now incumbent on all Christian people to press the admission of Germany and other nations into the League at the very earliest moment that conditions rendered it possible. It praised the work of the new International Labor Organization. We understand on good authority that this body has accomplished more in 8 months for the regulation and betterment of industrial conditions and had been accomplished in years by the old methods of dealing with international affairs. Russia was still an unknown quantity. America hesitates, and Germany is still outside. Christians must overcome skepticism and doubt. We believe that a bold venture of faith will rally to the League all the unmeasured forces of goodwill which are latent in the nations of the earth. A footnote acknowledged that the committee was not quite unanimous, for while the American bishops had cordially agreed with the principle of the League of Nations, they felt obliged to withhold their support of the existing covenant without certain reservations. When the report was received by the bishops July 27, Donaldson was at pains to allude in particular to the generosity with which the American bishops had taken their part in the deliberations. Turn now to Reverend Audred Sprinza on the leaked draft of the Supreme Court decision. Sadly, it's not just American leaders who are at fault. Polls indicate that 30% of Americans oppose abortion, while 70% approve. This is nothing new. The evil kings of Judah and Israel, like the heathen around them, cause their children to pass through the fire of the idol of Moloch. Under current law, government cannot interfere with a woman's choice to terminate a pregnancy before 23 weeks. That is the amount of time that it is believed a fetus can live outside the womb. We have a guest arriving, so I'll have to draw this edition to a close. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Godspeed.